No one notices the moment an idea enters their mind. There is no sound, no announcement, no warning. Yet some ideas don't just visit, they settle in. They rearrange how you see truth, history, and even yourself. David Bell was never interested in being loud. While philosophers competed for attention with grand systems and dramatic declarations, Bell worked in silence, dismantling certainty, piece by piece. And that may be exactly why his work is so unsettling, because David Bell does not tell you what to think. He shows you how fragile your thinking already is. Long before his name circulated in academic corridors, Bell was a quiet observer of contradiction. Born in Britain into a culture steeped in intellectual tradition, he grew up surrounded by the legacy of certainty, empiricism, logic, and the belief that reason, properly used, could explain the world. But Bell noticed something early. Reason didn't fail loudly. It failed politely. Rare fact number 1. As a young student, Bell became dissatisfied not with philosophical answers, but with the confidence behind them. He once described philosophy as a discipline that often pretends to see more clearly than it actually does. This dissatisfaction would become his lifelong tension. At university, while others raced toward fashionable theories, Bell lingered over difficult texts, Kant, Hegel, and the shadowy space between them. He wasn't looking for conclusions. He was studying limits, what reason can do, and what it can never touch. Bell's academic path didn't follow the usual arc of ambition. He avoided public intellectual celebrity. No television debates. No simplified manifestos. His work moved slowly, deliberately, like someone unwilling to lie for clarity. Rare fact number 2. Bell was known among colleagues for rewriting the same passage dozens of times, not to perfect style, but to remove hidden assumptions he believed language smuggles into thought. Language, for Bell, was never neutral. Words do not simply describe reality. They shape it, and that was the problem. As Bell began teaching, students often found his lectures unsettling. Not because they were confusing, but because they removed intellectual safety nets. Bell refused to let ideas stand simply because they were inherited. He would pause mid-lecture, ask a question, then wait. Silence was part of his method. Rare fact number 3. Bell believed silence was philosophically necessary, a space where students confronted their own uncertainty rather than filling it with borrowed opinions. This approach made him quietly controversial. Some accused him of offering no answers. Bell didn't deny it. Because answers, he believed, are often where thinking stops. David Bell's most important work circles a dangerous idea, that modern philosophy misunderstood its own foundations. Where Enlightenment thinkers believed reason could map reality, Bell suspected reason had been mistaking its own structure for the structure of the world. In his studies of Kant, Bell focused not on moral rules or systems, but on tension, the struggle between what humans can know and what they desperately want to know. Rare fact number 4. Bell argued that Kant was often read as more confident than he actually was. That Kant's true project was an exploration of human limitation, not dominance over nature. This reinterpretation unsettled traditional readings. Bell wasn't tearing Kant down. He was stripping him bare. In doing so, Bell exposed something uncomfortable. Philosophy often disguises fear as certainty. Fear of ambiguity. Fear of not knowing. Fear that reason might not be enough. As his reputation grew within academic philosophy, Bell resisted turning his ideas into slogans. He published carefully, selectively, refusing to simplify arguments for broader appeal. Rare fact number 5. Bell declined multiple opportunities to popularize his work, believing mass simplification transforms philosophy into ideology. To Bell, ideology was philosophy that had stopped questioning itself, and history was full of its consequences. What made David Bell dangerous, quietly dangerous, was not radical claims, but disciplined restraint. He refused to promise, meaning where none could be guaranteed. He did not tell you who you are. He asked whether you had ever truly examined the tools you used to decide. As the 20th century unfolded, marked by war, political extremism, and technological acceleration, Bell became increasingly concerned with how abstract ideas moved into real-world power. Philosophy, he warned, does not stay in books. It leaks into law, into education, into how societies justify themselves. Rare fact number 6. Bell believed many political disasters were not caused by irrationality, but by overconfidence in rational systems detached from human complexity. This was not an attack on reason. It was a warning, because reason, when unexamined, becomes tyranny wearing logic's face. Bell's students often left his classes unsettled rather than inspired. He did not offer hope as a conclusion. He offered clarity as a burden. To think seriously, Bell believed it, is to accept discomfort. There would be no final harmony, no perfect system, only responsibility. Responsibility to question even the frameworks that taught you how to question. Rare fact number 7. Bell once described philosophy as the discipline that survives by doubting its own survival. That sentence captures his legacy. A thinker who refused closure, a philosopher who treated certainty as something to be earned and often denied. By the end of chapter 1, one thing becomes clear. David Bell is not here to give you answers. He is here to remove the illusion that answers ever protected you. And this is only the beginning, because once reason turns inward, there is no safe distance left. Ideas do not remain innocent for long. They start as questions. They become frameworks, and eventually, they learn how to rule. David Bell understood this transformation better than most, not because he studied politics directly, but because he studied something more dangerous. How reason quietly aligns itself with authority. Bell believed philosophy's greatest failure was not error. It was obedience. By the time Bell was fully immersed in his academic work, the modern world had already begun worshipping systems, political systems, economic systems, educational systems, all claiming rational foundations. Efficiency replaced wisdom. Logic replaced judgment, and Bell watched closely. What disturbed him was not that societies used reason, but that they stopped questioning whose reason was being used. Rare fact number 8. Bell argued that modern institutions often borrow philosophical language to legitimize power, even when the underlying ideas have been stripped of their original uncertainty. In other words, philosophy becomes decoration. Bell's work increasingly focused on how abstract thinking migrates into concrete authority. He believed ideas did not merely influence power. They trained it. Once an idea becomes useful to control, it stops being examined. Bell returned repeatedly to Kant, not as a moral guide, but as a warning. He saw in Kant's work an honest struggle with limits, a struggle later thinkers softened, simplified, and weaponized. Reason was no longer a boundary. It became a justification. Rare fact number 9. Bell believed many Enlightenment ideals survived not because they were understood, but because they were useful to emerging bureaucratic states. This was not cynicism. It was observation. Bell noticed that reason behaves differently when it answers to no one. In classrooms, reason questions. In institutions, reason categorizes. Labels replace understanding. Rules replace judgment. Metrics replace meaning. Bell warned that once thinking becomes procedural, it stops being philosophical. It becomes administrative. And administration, Bell believed, has no conscience, only compliance. His lectures during this period grew more intense, though never louder. He spoke about responsibility, not moral responsibility in the traditional sense, but intellectual responsibility. To Bell, the greatest ethical failure was allowing one's thinking to become automatic. Rare fact number 10. Bell criticized the growing reliance on models and frameworks, arguing they train thinkers to trust structure over experience. This critique unsettled many students trained to seek clarity through systems. Bell did not reject systems. He rejected obedience to them. As technology accelerated and data-driven thinking became dominant, Bell grew more concerned. Rationality was no longer slow. It was fast, scalable, detached, and dangerous. Bell feared a world where decisions were made by processes no one fully understood, but everyone trusted. Rare fact number 11. Bell warned that rational systems often mask value judgments behind technical language, making moral responsibility difficult to locate. Who decides? The system, the algorithm, policy, responsibility, dissolves. This dissolution haunted Bell. Because philosophy, at its core, is about accountability. Bell believed thinking must answer for itself, yet modern life rewarded the opposite. Efficiency without reflection. He began writing more directly about power, not as domination, but as invisibility. The most effective power, Bell believed, does not announce itself. It hides inside procedures, inside best practices, inside rational outcomes. Rare fact number 12. Bell once remarked that the most dangerous ideas are those that no longer appear ideological. They appear neutral, objective, unquestionable. Bell's skepticism extended even to academia. Universities, he believed, were increasingly complicit, training students to manage ideas rather than confront them. Knowledge became something to apply, not to struggle with. Bell resisted this shift. He refused simplified curricula. He rejected assessment models that rewarded memorization over doubt. Rare fact number 13. Bell believed education should produce discomfort before competence. This stance made him respected and quietly isolated. But Bell accepted isolation. He believed philosophy had always been a lonely discipline. The thinker who asks too many questions is rarely welcomed by systems that depend on certainty. As global politics grew more polarized, Bell became increasingly concerned with emotional reasoning, not emotion itself, but emotional certainty. He saw movements driven by outrage, certainty, and moral urgency, and recognized the familiar danger. Emotion can silence doubt faster than logic ever could. Rare fact number 14. Bell warned that emotional certainty often disguises itself as moral clarity, making violence easier to justify. Reason, for all its flaws, at least hesitates. Emotion accelerates. Bell's fear was not reason's absence, but reason's surrender. When reason stops questioning its own role, it becomes a servant, and servants rarely ask where they are being led. David Bell's philosophy does not accuse individuals. It accuses comfort. The comfort of believing systems are neutral. The comfort of believing procedures absolve responsibility. The comfort of believing thinking can be delegated. Bell believed every generation inherits ideas already aligned with power. The task of philosophy is not to celebrate them. It is to interrogate them. Rare fact number 15. Bell described philosophy as the art of refusing inherited certainty. By the end of chapter 2, the tension is unmistakable. Reason is not innocent. Ideas do not remain pure. And philosophy, when it stops questioning itself, becomes an accomplice. Bell does not offer an escape. He offers a demand. To think fully is to accept responsibility for how your thinking shapes the world. And that responsibility cannot be outsourced. Because once reason begins to serve power, it rarely remembers how to stop. Some philosophers leave behind systems. Others leave behind movements. David Bell left behind something far more unsettling. A silence that demands responsibility. As Bell grew older, he became increasingly aware of a paradox that haunted his work. The more the modern world claimed to value critical thinking, the less it tolerated genuine uncertainty. Universities spoke of openness while narrowing acceptable conclusions. Institutions praised questioning, but only within safe boundaries. Bell noticed that philosophy was becoming respectable, and respectability worried him. He believed philosophy should remain dangerous, not because it incites rebellion, but because it refuses reassurance. True thinking, Bell argued, does not calm anxiety. It exposes Italiano. In private conversations with colleagues, Bell often expressed concern that philosophy was being absorbed in a professional routine. Papers were produced, conferences organized, careers advanced, but something essential was being lost. The risk. Bell believed that once thinking becomes predictable, it stops being thinking at all. One of the lesser-known aspects of Bell's later work was his growing focus on interpretation, not of texts, but of lives. He argued that humans constantly interpret themselves through borrowed categories: success, failure, rationality, productivity. These categories feel neutral. They are not. Bell believed they were inherited judgments, disguised as facts. In seminars late in his career, Bell began asking students a question. He never answered himself. Who taught you what counts as a reasonable life? The question lingered. No framework followed. No guidance. Just discomfort. Bell believed philosophy should end that way. He grew especially skeptical of the growing alliance between rational theory and emerging technology. Decision-making was becoming automated. Ethical choices were being translated into data points. Efficiency replaced reflection, and Bell saw a familiar danger, returning reason once again mistaking its own structure for truth. He warned that systems built to optimize outcomes often erase responsibility. When harm occurs, no one decides it happened. It was the model, the process, the system. Bell rejected this logic entirely. To him, responsibility could not be delegated, not to institutions, not to technology, not to tradition. One of the more quietly revealing moments in Bell's career came when he was asked to contribute to a collaborative project intended to apply philosophy to policy design. Bell declared, not because he opposed engagement, but because he believed philosophy should resist becoming an instrument. Once philosophy promises solutions, it risks becoming another tool of control. Bell's refusal puzzled many, but it was consistent. He did not want his thinking to close debates, only to open them. As debates around morality, law, and artificial intelligence intensified, Bell's work began resurfacing in unexpected places. Scholars cited him not for answers, but for warnings. That was his role. Bell never positioned himself as a moral authority. He distrusted moral certainty, especially when it arrived too easily. Instead, he insisted on something more difficult: ongoing accountability. To Bell, ethics was not a rulebook. It was a burden that could not be handed over. In one of his final public lectures, Bell spoke briefly about legacy. He dismissed the idea that philosophers should aim to be remembered. Being remembered, he said, is often a sign that the questions were too neatly packaged. What mattered was not remembrance, but disturbance. Bell wanted his work to unsettle long after his name faded. As his health declined, Bell continued writing slowly, carefully, without urgency. He revised sentences not to sharpen arguments, but to soften false confidence. He believed clarity without humility was dangerous, and humility, Bell insisted, was intellectual discipline, not modesty. Those close to him noted that Bell never dramatized his ideas. He did not perform philosophy. He lived it quietly, consistently, without spectacle. When David Bell died, there were no dramatic final statements, no manifesto left unfinished. His papers revealed no grand conclusion, only questions. That absence was intentional. Bell believed philosophy ends best where it began in uncertainty. Today, David Bell's influence is difficult to trace, as it does not announce itself. It appears in hesitation, in scholars who resist premature conclusions, in thinkers who distrust elegant solutions, in moments where certainty feels too comfortable. Bell's work remains especially relevant in a world obsessed with optimization. Algorithms promise objectivity. Systems promise fairness. Metrics promise truth. Bell's voice, quiet but persistent, asks a single question: who is responsible when thinking becomes automatic? He offers no escape from that question, no refuge, only accountability. Bell believed that freedom does not come from better systems, but from the refusal to surrender judgment. To think fully is to accept risk. The risk of being wrong, the risk of uncertainty, the risk of standing without guarantees. This is why David Bell never became a public philosopher. Public philosophy demands reassurance. Bell demanded responsibility, and responsibility is never popular. As the chapter closes, one truth remains. David Bell did not change how the world thinks. He changed how thinking survives by refusing to let it rest, by refusing to let it hide behind systems, by refusing to let certainty go unchallenged. His philosophy does not follow you loudly. It waits. And when you reach for easy answers, when a system promises neutrality, when reason claims innocence, Bell's question returns. Who is thinking for you now? And are you willing to take responsibility for the answer?